feels a year away, like the seconds, the beginning and the end. But if in time it's yesterday, your picture's gonna bring it home to me again.
Welcome friends, in this video I'm building a bumper mounted tire carrier for the Raptor using my SVC off-road Baja Bumper as the base. I made a very basic build plan based on bumper width just to order the steel needed for the project. When I had the time to build, I started by determining the height of the main mounting plates, which was about 6 inches, so I did 7 inches just to be safe. I cut the mounting plates out of 3/8 inch mild steel to be sure that there wouldn't be any bending of the plate itself while I was driving. After smoothing out the edges on the plates, I marked the bumper at the pinch rivet to identify where the plate should end to avoid hitting the tailgate. I ground off the powder coat around the mounting point and tried to level the plate vertically using magnets to hold it in place and using the bumper flat points with an electric angle finder to zero out my driveway slope. I tacked both sides in place and moved on to the hinge, which I was mounting on the passenger side. I ground off the mill scale around the weld points, held the hinge in place with some vice grips, and tacked it on level with the bumper. I wasn't sure what my full plan was for the arm, but I tried using angle iron to mark a straight line to help with making multiple bends on the 1.5 by 120 wall DOM tubing. This didn't work because it ended up twisting slightly while I was marking it, but also because I ended up remembering that I needed to place the weld of the tubing on the inside of the bend, so I ended up marking the weld line at the cut and then using a straight edge to draw the full line. I had been welding on the truck, so I disconnected both batteries, which meant that I couldn't run the truck and use the air compressor that I have built into the truck without a lot of work anyway. So I pumped the affordable bender by hand, moving that tubing to 15 degrees, which is where I assumed that I needed it to sit. Testing the fitment, I found that it needed a bit more bend, so I added another 5 degrees for a total of 20 degrees on each side. The test fitment wasn't perfect in that it didn't follow the SVC line. 17 or 18 degrees may have been better, but it still worked, so I marked where to cut for the hinge, and since I don't have a tube notcher yet, I used an angle grinder to cut out the notch for the hinge. Once I verified fitment, I set out to duplicate the first tube with less waste, and taking less time now that I knew the actual measurements that I needed and how to mark the tubing. The two weren't exactly the same, but they were pretty close, so I called it good and pulled off the hinge for welding. I tacked everything in place, giving myself some space for the weld on the outside. I did bevel the tubing a bit, but I think I should have done a little bit more to make a flatter weld. I test fit the first tube and confirmed that it was centered on the bumper once level. Then I did some weird stuff, like some really weird use of material to create the perfect and a level gap between the tubing before tacking the second tube into place on the hinge. I originally thought that the support strips would be thick enough, like height-wise, for dimple dies, and I felt bad about not buying a press and dies, but I'm glad I didn't waste the money because the gap was way too small anyway. The first two support strips I made out of 3/16 mild steel and positioned them on the outside of each bend. I honestly hadn't thought out the driver's side too much, which you can tell from my original plan, so I figured that I needed an additional support on that side which would hold the tubing, but also give me space to integrate the latch, which I needed to be pretty deep. I chose to use the thickest angle iron I had laying around as the base and then cut it around half the width of that mounting plate on the driver's side. The angle iron was too short to hold the arm in place and leave space for a bumper, so I also added some 3/16 inch plate to extend it horizontally. I ordered a large sheet of Delrin from Amazon for a wear plate, which would be where the arm tubing was actually resting on. I could replace this piece whenever it wore out. Now I could lock the support piece into place using the 1/4 inch Delrin to identify where everything needed to sit to keep the arm level while latched for driving. I tacked it in and then cut a 1/4 inch piece of mild steel, which I would use to mount the latch itself. I borrowed heavily from the design I already knew, which was Ratha Sochenda's tire carrier design. I finish welded everything that I currently had on the arm and figured it was time to cut out the heavy-duty gussets for the mounting plates. I figured out the best use of the 3/8 inch mild steel I had left using cardboard as a template, and then I cut it out. Then I pulled off the bumper, which was surprisingly easy using sawhorses, which is honestly just coincidental based on the rear of the vehicle's ride height. Anyway, I tacked the gussets into place on both sides before getting the idea to add a third support tube to the bumper itself, since I was worried about the weight twisting the SVC main tube, which is 1 3/4 inch. I spent a few hours fitting and grinding each side until I could weld them into place.
The world is waiting up.
Then I added a second, smaller gusset before finish welding the rest of the bumper connections and moving on to the latch point for the bumper, which I decided to use some spare tubing cut in half with 1/4 inch plate. Once I welded it up and then ground it down, I could center it and then weld it into position. Now it was time for the fitment test, and it nearly fit. I just needed to trim the arm tubing about 1/8 of an inch and then cut off the excess metal from the mounting plates.
The world is waiting, half a step beyond our door.
Then I added an extra plate for the bumper point and welded in the latch point. With the bumper point ground down, I could drill and tap the bolt hole for the bumper and test fit it.
If it's not enough.
Then I started adding additional support for the arm. Some inches of weld for the hinge connection point and the plate for the bumper connection on the latch side. Then I could drill and tap the holes for the latch itself and test fit that also.
I wanna see the stuff the world has got in store.
Now I actually cut and retacked the hinge mount, rotating it 1 degree clockwise before finish welding it to make sure that there were no issues once weight was applied. Then I welded in a lower support gusset for the latch side and added some tabs for my backup lights to mount to. I nearly forgot to add the hinge safety, so I reassembled the whole thing and tacked on the safety. When I tested it, everything seemed to work fine, so I just finish welded it into place. I really didn't want to do this, but I knew I needed a test fit of the bumper before painting, so I threw it back onto the truck and leveled it to verify fitment.
I wanna take it all in, I'm falling. The cityscape by night, wanna catch in my photos. Where you go, every corner twice as bright. They'll be my treasures forever. When I can't hold you tight, I'll see the Stockholm lights. The Stockholm.
It seemed like I had already done so much, but I hadn't even built the actual tire carrier yet, and I was thinking that I probably wouldn't get to the jack mount in the time that I had left. I moved on though and measured out what I thought would be the appropriate height of the vertical support with enough space to cut it to fit into the arm tubes. This was kind of a disaster and it took forever, so I quit recording. But I got it done and then cut the horizontal support for easy adjustment. Next was welding on the vertical support's 2.5 inch upper tube, which I should have tacked first and then checked it, since it ended up a little crooked despite the use of all those fixtures. The last part to prep for the tire mount test fit was the plate itself. I planned on using actual hub studs that I saved from when I swapped the wheel hubs and bearings a couple years ago. The problem is that the holes Ratha made are too small for that, so I needed to drill them out. The 1/4 inch plate is definitely tough though, and it ate through a set of my cobalt bits, and I had to wait to buy new ones the next day to finish the job. What I could still do, without running to the store, is tack on the vertical support. I lined it up, centered on the arm, and made sure that it was level and plumb with the bumper before tacking it on. Once I got the new cobalt step bits, I drilled out the holes, hammered the studs into position, and welded them onto the plate. Now I could test fit the tire itself. and make some spacing adjustments by sliding the horizontal support through the 2.5-inch square tube to get the tire about 2 inches from the tailgate. After cutting off the excess, I tacked on the horizontal support and did one more test fit. I made the depth of the horizontal support shallow to keep the tire close, but that meant that the side supports would block the tire from sitting flush. So I decided to get fancy. I made the primary bends for the side supports at 90 degrees and then turned the tube on its side to make an additional bend, which would go around the tire's sidewall. After mirroring this on the other side and notching out the lower mounting point, I could tack it into place for a test fit. It wasn't perfect because of the angle of the 2.5-inch tube, but it looked pretty good. Yay! Now I could finish weld the arm, which took forever, but I used that time to think about how the hell I was going to make a mount for the Pro Eagle jack. I started this project on a Monday, and it was Friday evening at this point. I honestly thought maybe I'd just call it and not do the mount. But after thinking about it Friday night and Saturday morning, I came up with a plan. My original plan was an additional support that was spaced so that I could bolt the Pro Eagle mount directly into the two tubes, but there was much less space than I had expected. The jack is tall and wide, and I wanted to match it up with the bend in the arm while leaving some tire space in case I decide to go to 39s later. It had to be high up enough to clear the parking sensors in the bumper also. So I decided to use the leftover 3/16-inch plate to make the mounting surface, and then I cut up some extra bits as support while welding it all to the inner support arm, closest to the hinge, in order to reduce leverage. I thought 3/16 was going to be too thin to hold the heavy jack, but with all the extra support bits and inches of weld, it was solid. I finished up the welding Sunday morning, spent a few hours grinding off all the mill scale, and it was time for paint Sunday evening. I used 3 coats of VHT roll bar and chassis paint, which is just awesome stuff. It took me 3 cans to paint the arm and touch up the portions of the SVC bumper that I took the powder coat off of. Monday morning, I reinstalled the bumper and leveled it out. I added the wear pad for the hinge bracket, packed the bearings with grease, and installed the seals before mounting the arm onto the bumper. I installed the latch bolts and safety pin with Loctite, and it was done. Except, putting everything on. I threw on the Pro Eagle mount, then the tire, and finally the jack itself. All done, right? Well, yes, but actually no. The tire and jack sat too low for the sensors, so I had to cut new notches in the plastic surrounds to flip the interior sensors upside down and point them a little further south. I also wanted to fix the issue I was having with the backup camera. If you watch the hitch-mounted tire carrier build that I did, you know that I bought a bunch of connectors to reroute the camera, but it eliminated the parking lines on the screen, and I wanted those parking lines back because it's impossible to pull the truck in forward, and I always end up backing in. I found that the issue was that those connectors changed the feed to analog, which didn't work with the Ford system. So I lopped off the camera connector in the tailgate and replaced it with a 6-inch pin connector paired with a 5-wire cable to run the connection to the spare tire. I wasn't done though. The camera mount I made with the Method center cap didn't sit straight with the new camera wiring, so I decided to fab up a mount using exhaust pipe, sheet metal, and the 1.5-inch tubing. I verified the angle, made the cuts, welds, and grinds, and put it all together. After some fresh paint, it all fit and worked flawlessly. So, final thoughts are that this project took way longer than I thought, like always. But 8 days when I planned for only 2 days is just insane. This video was comprised of only 8 hours of footage when I actually worked 10 to 12 hours each day on this. That did include me just staring at the bumper and parts for hours trying to come up with a design that was low profile. It allowed for use of the parking sensors, the blind spot monitor system, and still have view out of the rear view mirror. Another note is that I used more abrasives than I expected, and also new ones, like the mil scale abrasives, which substantially shortened my paint prep time. I still ended up overusing some abrasives and was left with an unsightly appearance in some areas. But a lot of the unsightliness resulted from my welds. I'm still learning to weld, and I thought that more projects would mean more practice and better welds. That is true in a sense, but when the time started crunching on me, I ended up caring less and less about getting the settings right or scrapping a weld and starting over. I still don't have the confidence that I need, and I'm going to try to find some time between work projects and editing to get into a real class. One of my favorite parts of this build is the locking latch from Trail Forged. I didn't like using the standard latch on my last build, so when I found this one, I was pleasantly surprised with the price and capability. Making sure that the tire carrier arm was as secure as possible was very important to me. I wasn't crazy about the red color being the only color, but I highly recommend this latch. For the carrier arm itself, it's pretty bare. I'm glad that I went with round tubing to match the SVC bumper instead of rectangular tubing, but it's so wide that I think it looks a little odd. I didn't want to add too much weight, but I could always add on a mount for max tracks or fuel cans or even a table on the inside. Those all seem kind of silly right now though, since I have to admit I haven't even used my iCamper yet. I bought it last November, but I've been out of the state for work 5.5 out of the last 9 months. I'm hoping to get a couple of trips in this summer though, since I'll actually be around now. My last note here is that I really like the VHT roll bar and chassis paint. It's thick, it's tough, and it's durable. And it's still holding up great on my affordable bender. What it is not good at is matching the color of the SVC's powder coat. This is the matte or satin VHT paint, not even the glossy one, and it's still too shiny to match the SVC bumper. I'll have to, eventually scuff up and repaint the whole thing, which is probably good, since the SVC bumper is already starting to rust in some areas. Anywho, I am so proud that I actually followed through with taking this project on, and even though there was a time crunch, I felt like it was fun and fulfilling to do something custom for myself. I hope you took something away from the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.